today's sort of question, the question that I'm sort of been addressing in recent research is how do we measure the threat of terrorism within Central Asia and the threat of terrorism beyond Central Asia by Central Asians in the diaspora? In July 2018, 5 young men from Tajikistan appeared on a video that was posted by Amaq, which is the Islamic State's media outlet. In the video, speaking in broken Russian, they proclaimed their allegiance to al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, and criticized the government of Tajikistan and stated their intention to conduct attacks within Tajikistan. A few days later, they took 2 cars, ran over 4 cyclists, Western tourists from Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the United States, and killed 4 of them with a car and knife attack. This was an attack that was significant for Central Asia for at least 2 reasons. First, it was the first attack targeting Western tourists in the region. Previously, there had been hostage takings by the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan during its incursion sort of in 1999-2000. There had been attacks targeting the Israeli and US embassies in Tashkent in Uzbekistan in 2004. And there have been certain other sort of killings and hostage takings in Tajikistan in the tail end of the civil war. But this was the first attack specifically targeting Western tourists within the region. Second, it's important because it was the first attack that's been credibly linked to ISIS. The video that was posted 2 days after the attack showed that there had been some sort of communication between members of ISIS and the attackers in the run-up to the attack. And so, as I'm going to talk about today, sort of in the first half of the presentation, this really moved beyond and sort of went against the general trend of terrorist attacks that we've seen within the region of Central Asia so far. Central Asia has also hit headlines for reasons and links to terrorism involving Central Asians beyond the region. So, on the left, we have Saifullah Saipov, who conducted an attack in Halloween in October 2017 in New York, killing 8 people, just sort of meters from the World Trade Center, the most significant attack in New York since 9/11. We also have photos of Akbar John Jalilov on the right, who in April 2017 conducted an attack, or was accused of conducting an attack, killing 14 people on the St. Petersburg subway. At the bottom, we have Abdulbakir Masharipov from Uzbekistan, who was accused of, on New Year's Day 2017, of conducting an attack in the Reina nightclub in Istanbul. Up at the top, we have Rakhmat Akilov, also from Uzbekistan, who was accused of conducting an attack in Stockholm in April 2017. And down here on the left, we have Gulmurod Halimov, who was the former head of Amman in Tajikistan, who spectacularly defected to ISIS in May 2015. So each of the times these attacks have occurred, we've heard how the region is becoming an exporter of terrorism, how it shows that it's becoming a hotbed of extremism, and that it's becoming a new producer of foreign fighters and terrorists and become a global threat. My presentation today forms part of a number of publications. One is a report that's being published by Harvard's Belfer Center, by Russia Matters, which is sort of an organization within Harvard's Belfer Center, and that really looks at the threat beyond the region from Central Asians. As part of that report initially, I was tasked with looking at the threat of terrorism within Central Asia, and the elements that were then edited out of this report are going to become part of a new Kennan cable published by the Kennan Institute, where I'm, as Marlene mentioned, where I am a fellow, which hopefully both of those reports will be coming out in the coming weeks. The sort of third part of my presentation, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the causes of terrorism and violent extremism within the region, have been published in various places, most recently in the Harriman magazine, published by the Harriman Institute, where I was a fellow, postdoctoral fellow up until recently. So what I'm talking about today is really a response to a potential criticism, I guess, of work like mine, which was leveled by Anna Matvieva and Antonio Guistosi in a recent peer-reviewed journal article. And they criticized scholars such as myself who've been critical towards the level of the terrorist threat within Central Asia. And they, using largely interviews with security services, government officials, and some civil society representatives, said that, well, no, the threat is much more significant than we are giving it credit for. And it's the reality that cannot be ignored. In doing so, they sort of criticized the work of myself and others who've claimed that the threat is being manipulated, it's being scripted and spun by the governments. And I think by making the argument that the threat is being manipulated, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I think this is maybe where some of critics of our work have sort of misread it. In claiming that the radical Islamic threat in Central Asia is a myth, as David Montgomery and John Heathershaw did in a sort of a publication for Chatham House a number of years ago, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Bullets are real. People have been killed as a result of political violence within the region. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the way that the threat itself has been manipulated. So, taking that as my cue, I looked back and sort of have looked at the terrorist attacks that have occurred within the region over the past 10 years, so 2008 to 2018. Taking the longer view, initially I thought, well, I'll use the START, the terrorist database published by the University of Maryland. And according to that, since 1970, just 0.001% of terrorist attacks around the world have occurred within Central Asia. But then I realized a number of the attacks that are contained within this START database weren't really acts of terrorism. Some things were missed, some things were included. So I decided to develop my own data set, as I'm going to talk about today. In terms of the foreign fighters, if 2,000 to 4,000 Central Asians have gone to fight in Syria and Iraq, that makes up just 0.001% of the region's population. Based on my definition of terrorism that is quite expansive and includes acts that have been initiated by non-state actors that have been labeled as terrorist groups. So it excludes counter-terrorism operations, but it includes attacks and violent acts that have been attributed to a variety of actors, including groups that potentially do not have such viable links to terrorism, such as the murder of the head of the GKMB, the security services in Horog in July 2012 by supporters of Tolibai Mbekov, a local commander, and the murder of 12 people in Almaty in 2012, in August 2012, that the authorities blamed on an extremist religious group unknown origin. So this is even if we take such a broad definition, I've identified only 18 terrorist attacks in the region since 2008. Now, these terrorist attacks have occurred in Astana in 2011. You can see from the graphic. A number of them have occurred, obviously, in Kazakhstan, some in Tajikistan. They include attacks and violent incidents in Horog, in the Pamir, an ambush in Kamarov in 2010 where 25 soldiers from Tajikistan were killed as part of the conflict there. What the government of Tajikistan has claimed to be a coup attempt in 2015 by a former deputy defense minister. And obviously most recently the attack in Dangara in southern Tajikistan. So a range of different attacks across the region, but only 18 in total. So since 2008, according to this data set, 142 individuals have died as a result of terrorist attacks. The vast majority have been members of the law enforcement bodies of the country. And these have been a disproportionate number of targets within these attacks, as I've mentioned, which further evidence that the recent attack in Tajikistan sort of broke with this norm. And 49 of the casualties that I include in that 142 are members of the terrorist groups themselves. The 23 civilian casualties, with the exception of the 4 who were killed in southern Tajikistan in July, were oftentimes collateral damage. Oftentimes they died because they got in the way, and there was limited evidence that they were being targeted directly by these acts. Half of the incidents have occurred in the region's most prosperous country, Kazakhstan, but half of the deaths have occurred in Tajikistan. So what are the sort of common features of these attacks? What can we identify as the overarching sort of themes that we see in these 18 attacks in the last 10 years? As I said before, almost all of them have targeted law enforcement agencies, so the security services, the police, and the military. Now, I think there are 2 ways in which sort of these terrorist attacks are related to the state. Specifically in the case of Tajikistan, a number of the violent incidents, as we've seen, most recently in Dushanbe and Baghdad in 2015, also in Horog, in the Pamir, and in the Rasht Valley between sort of 2009 and 2011, involved individuals who'd been incorporated into the state as a part of the peace-building process initiated after the end of the Civil War, but then they'd lost their positions within the state. And sort of through this process that John Heathershire and Parviz Mullajanov have called authoritarian conflict management. So they were incorporated into the state, they were given the benefits of being incorporated into the state, such as access to various illicit revenues, shall we say, and then they were pushed out of the state. And as a result of being pushed out of the state, they reacted violently to this, and this sort of drove the political violence that we've seen in the country. In the case of many of the attacks in Kazakhstan, we've seen people who've been disgruntled with the police and security services. So Ruslan Kulikbayev, who shot 3 policemen and a civilian in Almaty in July 2016, was reportedly radicalized whilst in prison, and he claimed the attack was an act of revenge against law enforcement officials who had tortured him and his brothers in a sort of religious sense rather than the literal sense. Rahim John Makhatov, who blew himself up in the Kazakhstan's first suicide bombing on May the 17th, 2011, was also reportedly acting in protest to the government's restrictive religious laws and abuse of prisoners. So oftentimes we see individuals, many of whom have links to organized criminal groups, who have actively targeted law enforcement as a result of being disgruntled with them. Most recently in the case of the Aktobe shootings in Aktobe, Kazakhstan in 2016. So that's the first sort of theme, the idea that law enforcement agencies have been sort of predominant targets of this. Secondly, as the map indicates, most of the attacks have occurred sort of in peripheral areas. They've occurred predominantly in Kazakhstan's western area, in Aktobe, in Atral, in areas like Taraz back in 2011 when there was a mass shooting, and in the case of Tajikistan in peripheral areas such as the Pamir and the Rasht Valley areas that were traditionally associated with the opposition. So potentially there is a link here with sort of core periphery relations and the disproportionate sort of level of economic development within the country. The third sort of theme or feature that we've seen across most of the attacks within Central Asia in the past 10 years is, although some of the attacks have had some link to transnational jihadist movements, most of the attacks that have occurred within the region most of the attackers appear to have had limited links to sort of transnational Islamist movements. Some of the attacks were sort of lone wolf attacks by sort of self-radicalized individuals, such as the Almaty gunman Kulikbayev, Maksad Kariev, who killed 7 people in a series of attacks shooting attacks in Taraz in December 2011, also sort of fits this profile. A number of other attacks have occurred by individuals who've been inspired by jihadist propaganda, but without receiving direct orders from what we can build. The picture we have, direct orders from any external group, and that seems to be potentially, according to the Kazakh government's account of events, the case in the shootings in Aktobe in June 2016, when a number of militants, or a number of terrorists, robbed 2 gun shops, 16 individuals in total, and then attacked an army base. Nazarbayev, after that, said that they'd been inspired by ISIS to conduct those attacks, although there was limited evidence for this. And the fourth point is that all these attacks have been sporadic, they've been short-lived, and they've been relatively disorganized. Very occasionally, or almost in most cases, the attackers haven't made any specific demands. They haven't stated what their goals were. And when they have, such as in the case of the attackers in Tajikistan in July 2018, they've been rather vague in their sort of professed aims. So even though after each attack we've said, well, this is a new precedent, this is going to happen again and again, what we've seen is not a dramatic increase in the number of terrorist attacks. So in fact, when you look back at the number of terrorist attacks following this same definition for the previous decade, so 98 to 2008, you see a very similar number of casualties, I think 145 as opposed to 142. So we haven't seen a sort of a ramping up of the terrorist threat. It's also worth considering that this has also been something that we've been talking about for 30 or 40 years now. If you read the Sovietological accounts of various specialists on Islam during the Soviet Union, there was this idea that, of course, the main threat to the Soviet Union would come from Sufi brotherhoods and sort of clandestine networks of Sufis who would, eventually sort of overthrow or cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. Obviously, that didn't transpire. So I think we need to sort of be rather realistic in sort of assessing the actual level of threat within the country. In terms of the threat, the other two threats that are talked about in terms of the threat within Central Asia, the threat of returning foreign fighters and the threat of sort of spillovers from Afghanistan, we're also seeing a sort of a relatively limited picture. So taking the upper estimates, these are the estimates for each country, the upper estimates, they're a sort of mixture of government figures, estimates from groups like the Sufan Group. We obviously have between, I think, 2,300 and 4,300 individuals who've gone to Syria and Iraq. So what are the sort of scenarios? What is going to happen to these individuals now that the caliphate is potentially on the downturn? Well, for many of them, it was a one-way trip and they've been killed. Obviously, figures from Islamic State itself indicated that Tajik citizens were the #1 suicide bombers in terms of being used by Islamic State. So according to the government figures, at least 800 of these individuals have been killed. So that would leave, along with the fact that the second scenario, 300 from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan have now returned. Some have faced prosecution, others have faced amnesty. That would leave somewhere in the region of 1,000 to 3,000 individuals who are either still in Iraq or have moved on to other areas. An undisclosed number are also in prison, primarily in Iraq. Don't have precise figures on that. So the third scenario is moving to a third country. And we have seen some evidence, and this is part of another chapter in the report that I'm involved with at Harvard's Belfer Center, will be a chapter by Vera Mironova, and she spent time in Ukraine interviewing Russian-speaking former foreign fighters. Now, some of those individuals, from speaking to her, have given up their desire to fight. They're jaded, they're tired, and they're disillusioned with what they saw in Syria and Iraq. But some of them are laying low and waiting to potentially move to another battlefield or to conduct attacks within Europe. So that's certainly another scenario we could see play out. The fourth is the move of these individuals to another battlefield, the sort of case, historical case of the Afghan Arabs who sort of toured around to different theatres, applying their sort of trade, so to speak. So what evidence do we have that Central Asian fighters are moving to Afghanistan, given this is the sort of its geographical proximity, linguistic affinities with Central Asia makes it a logical destination for ex-fighters and new recruits. It obviously shares 2,300 kilometre border with Central Asia. So this is something we've been hearing in the media relatively frequently. And I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, so I won't talk in too much detail about what's going on. But theoretically, Islamic State, that's had a presence in Afghanistan for the past, sort of declared presence for the past 4 years, should be more appealing to Central Asians than the Taliban was, because it has a professed ideology and desire to expand north into post-Soviet Central Asia. So since declaring its presence in Afghanistan, we've seen it move beyond its initial base in Nangarhar, down on the border with Pakistan, up to Badakhshan on the border with Tajikistan, and more recently Jowzjan. Although now there are reports as of August that contingent in Jowzjan, which is on the border with Turkmenistan, have now been defeated by ISKP. There's a lot of debate over the strength of ISKP, Islamic State in Khorasan province. Afghan officials put the number at 3,000. If you read the Russian language media, you're talking about figures in the 10,000 or more. It's very difficult to ascertain their real strength within the country. Afghan authorities believe that 100 fighters entered the country to join ISKP in the first 6 months of 2017. We have seen some reports and videos coming out that Uzbek fighters had transferred from Syria to fight in Afghanistan. And we have seen some evidence that some Tajiks have been diverted. They couldn't go to Syria and Iraq because the border with Turkey was closed, and they were diverted via Iran across the border into Afghanistan. So the president of Tajikistan, Emom Ali Rahman, says there have been dozens of such individuals. At least within the media, 9 cases of Tajiks entering Afghanistan via Iran have been reported in the last year or so. So we're seeing some diversion, some individuals moving from Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan, some people being diverted to Afghanistan rather than to Syria and Iraq. But certainly, when compared with the number of recruits at the height of recruitment to Islamic State in 2014, 2015, we're not talking very significant numbers. We are seeing an increase in the number of violent border incidents. So this is based on the official figures from the border guards of Tajikistan. So you see from a figure of 14 in 2011 violent incidents, you see it peak at 31 last year. So you are seeing an uptick in the number of border incidents that in some way is linked to the movement of the Taliban and Islamic State up to the border with Tajikistan, strengthening their presence there, particularly after the US scaling back its forces within Afghanistan from 2014 onwards. But many of these skirmishes are linked to small-scale drug trafficking, and there have been a limited number of armed incursions. And as is the case with all of these attacks and incidences within Central Asia, oftentimes there are conflicting reports. Oftentimes the government prevents journalists and independent observers from visiting and trying to get a more sort of independent account of what's happened. And that's the perennial challenge with studying terrorism within the region. So that's sort of 3 facets of the terrorist threat within the region, all of which point to a threat that exists, undoubtedly, but in some ways has been over-exaggerated by a number of actors when we actually look at the data as I presented it today. What about the threat beyond the region? Significant Central Asian diasporas exist, primarily in Russia, where there are 2 to 4 million, 3 to 5 million, an undisclosed number of Central Asians living primarily as labour migrants, but sometimes as dual citizens and permanent residents. There are also significant diaspora or migrant communities in Turkey, where there are 100,000 to 200,000 Central Asians living, and in the United States, where there are approximately 250,000, and also in Europe, where there are somewhere in the region of under 100,000. As I pointed to in one of the first slides, some of these individuals, a small number, have been involved in a number of violent attacks. And these violent attacks since 2017 actually killed more people than all of those attacks in the past decade within Central Asia. So potentially, looking beyond the region, we are looking at a more significant threat. Attacks have been carried out by broadly speaking, 2 different types of Central Asians living abroad. Some of them have acted on orders or after direct contact with terrorist organizations, representatives primarily from Islamic State. Barakat Akilov, who was the Stockholm truck attacker in April 2017, according to the indictment by the Swedish government, had stated that he'd been in contact with no fewer than 30 Islamic State fighters in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan prior to the attack, one of whom, Tajik citizen, had taken a role sort of in mentoring him and preparing him for that attack. So we have seen people who've specifically been in contact with Islamic State operatives. The second are individuals like Saifullah Saipov, who were sort of self-radicalized. They were exposed to jihadist propaganda, but the evidence that we have indicates that they didn't have any specific contact via messaging or online communication with any sort of members or supporters of a terrorist organization. So, as I said, the number of casualties as a result of these varying attacks has actually been more than the number of casualties within the region itself. So, sort of final question linked to this, it's sort of, if we're going to assess the threat of terrorism within Central Asia, we have sort of a number of ways we can attempt to do that. It's never going to be a precise science, and I think we need to be reflexive about the limits of the knowledge we can really have about these issues. But we can obviously look at the historical record and what's changing within the region to try and sort of make certain statements about what the threat's been like, or how the threat may develop in the future. And we can also look at sort of the drivers of radicalization and extremist recruitment, which is what I'll briefly talk about to end on. So each individual's pathway to terrorist organization is different. So catch-all explanations of recruitment fail to sort of capture these complex dynamics that are at play. I think it's important to recognize the experience of those living in the diaspora who decide to conduct an attack in their place of residence, those remaining in Central Asia, those living as migrants in Russia who make the decision to travel to Syria and Iraq. These are all very different decisions. Right? They take a different sort of level of commitment, level of planning, and so we need to approach them sort of with that. We approach these issues with that in mind. Generally, research conducted by myself, people like Noah Tucker, Emil Nasreddinov, who's sitting somewhere in the back, amongst others, group from RUSI, the think tank in London. So the sort of survey and ethnographic and other data collection that we've had on this process of radicalization have pointed to the fact that factors such as poverty, a lack of education, and importantly, high levels of religiosity seem to play a limited role. We have numerous reports of recruits and those who've been susceptible to recruitment coming from highly educated backgrounds, middle-class backgrounds. Not all of them are in poverty, not all of them are sort of naive and lacking in education. I think there are a number of broad generalizations that don't apply in every case by all means, that have emerged from the knowledge and the sort of research that we have so far. First is that very few of the recruits, from the evidence that we have any sort of formal religious training. What we're seeing seems to be more Olivier Roy in the case of European jihadists and recruitments to Islamic State has observed and called the sort of, not a radicalization of Islam, where ideology seems to play a very important role, but an Islamization of radicalism. What we see is recruits who don't, oftentimes from the reports from their family members, those who've returned to face to be amnestied in places like Tajikistan. Most times they didn't have a religious upbringing, they didn't have formal religious training. They very quickly rediscover Islam, rapidly embracing this simplistic takfiri narrative, right? That there's good and there's evil, there are good guys and bad guys, and you need to kill the bad guys. And their lack of religious knowledge and sort of real comprehension of what Islam is really about makes them more susceptible to such simplistic narratives. So that's one of the takeaways that we have, that very few of them really have undergone advanced religious training. Most embrace religion quickly and radicalize rather quickly. The second takeaway from this research is that experiences of personal injustice, either at the hands of governments within the region, at the hands of the police and law enforcement. I know that's something that Noah Tucker, who's going to be presenting his documentary series here in the next few weeks, came across a lot in his focus groups in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The negative experiences at the hands of the police and law enforcement seem to be important in pushing certain individuals towards extremist groups. Experiences with corruption, so experiences with sort of governance in general and the weaknesses or the misuse of governance within the region seem to be important. But it's not only about relations to governments within the region. For a lot of individuals from the profiles that we have, they've often had a sense of personal failure. Their job didn't work out. They migrated to Russia expecting to have a certain life, and it didn't work out for them. Their marriage is broken down. They experience stigmatization and sort of personal and social problems, all of which made them sort of more vulnerable to recruitment. When I was living in Moscow in early 2015, really at the height of the sort of extremist recruitment, I was with some Tajik labor migrants who I knew who were constructing the Spartak Stadium for the World Cup in Moscow earlier this year. And they told me the story of Nassim, and this story sort of, I guess, typifies a lot of the stories that we've heard through the research that we have, sort of Central Asian recruitment. So Nassim arrived in Moscow in 2013. This is sort of the words from my fieldwork notes based on what his friends said about him. He was a smart guy, spoke Russian, good Russian, wanted to find a good job, but he couldn't. So he ended up in construction. In 2014, he went and married a girl from his village back in Tajikistan, but soon he came back. The marriage was not good, he became more angry and bitter, and when the recruiters came, he found their promises attractive. He never prayed before or talked about religion, but now he talked about jihad. One day he disappeared, the next thing we heard was in Syria. So his sort of story is relatively typical of someone who didn't have a religious background, who had some sort of sense of personal failure, personal injustice, who ended up being attracted to extremist groups. And I think it's important not to just think about the sort of push factors, there are also certain pull factors. And when one has experienced injustice or personal failure, the sort of messaging coming from groups like Islamic State to Central Asians is often quite positive. You know, it's offering them a sense of meaning, a sense of identity, individual fulfillment. These heroic images of jihadists living together, being given a wage, being offered a certain welfare system, adventure, brotherhood, can be quite attractive to individuals who are sort of disillusioned, such as Nassim. The third sort of broad conclusion from the research that we have, something again that Noah's found in his research and I found in my work on Tajikistan, is that networks matter. And this is a general conclusion and one of the few sort of agreements that have emerged from research on radicalization in general. So we have a lot of cases in Central Asia of people being recruited through social networks insofar as they knew someone personally who's been recruited to extremist groups. We have cases in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan of entire villages, family networks, extended family networks being recruited because one of them, or a few of them, fell under the sort of influence of recruiters. The fourth sort of broad takeaway is that migration itself is not a causal variable. A lot of people have talked about the way in which the majority of Central Asians have been recruited as labour migrants. I think that's generally the data that we have indicates that that's often the case, though less the case according to Emil's research on Kyrgyzstan. But migration itself is not a causal variable. I think the migrant experience and being a migrant in Russia maybe explains more the how people get recruited, because it's easier for those recruitment networks to exist in places like Moscow and big cities and other areas in Russia. But it doesn't really explain why. Realistically, really, radicalization is dynamic, it's non-linear, it's transnational. It's difficult to say whether someone was recruited and became vulnerable before or after migration. Oftentimes it's experiences across a long period of time that make them vulnerable to recruitment.
So what are the key takeaways from my presentation today? Well, first, the terrorist threat within Central Asia itself has been relatively limited since the country's gained independence from the Soviet Union. In the last 10 years, as I've talked about, there were 19 terrorist attacks, resulting in 142 casualties. Just to put that into perspective, at the same time in Kyrgyzstan alone, over 11,000 people died in road traffic accidents. That's just in Kyrgyzstan. So almost 100 times more casualties than were the result of terrorist attacks within the region. So I think that sort of puts into perspective the level of threat that we're talking about. As I said, it's a threat that needs to be taken seriously and needs to be engaged with by policymakers, but it's also a threat that's been manipulated and exaggerated by a variety of actors pursuing a variety of interests. When we have seen terrorist attacks within the region, or attacks that have been labelled as terrorism, as I've mentioned, most of those attacks have been really linked to local political dynamics, local political struggles, more so than international or transnational Islamist movements. There have been some spillovers on the border with Afghanistan, for example, especially in the last few years, as the Taliban and other militant groups have strengthened their presence in northern Afghanistan. But thus far, we haven't seen mass incursions of militants or mass spillovers from Afghanistan into Central Asia. So the threat within Central Asia itself has remained relatively limited. I think the greatest dangers, the greatest threats going forward with regards to terrorism, organized violence within the region, are the sort of attacks that we saw in July, in Tajikistan. Individuals who are radicalized in person or online, either in Central Asia or more likely abroad, who then decide to conduct attacks with simple weapons, such as knives, vehicles, or guns, weapons that are easy to get hold of. Such attacks are much more difficult to interdict, to prevent for the security services and law enforcement within the region, because they don't involve crossing multiple international borders in the way that becoming a foreign fighter does, and they often take a limited amount of planning and coordination between different parties. So these sort of attacks are difficult to prevent and do pose an albeit limited threat going forward. What is probably more likely to cause mass casualties is the sort of violence we've seen in the country so far, violence around ethnic tensions, violence linked to local political struggles, such as the situation currently in Gorno-Badakhshan in the east of Tajikistan, in which the government is seeking to wrest control from a number of former commanders who continue to play a key role in the local political economy around smuggling across the border with Afghanistan. These sort of dynamics in which the state tries to crack down on local opposition groups have often produced the greatest amount of violence within Central Asia, and I think it's these sort of local political struggles that will continue to have the potential to cause violence within the region. Also, the sort of dynamics of authoritarian governance in the region, as we've already discussed, pose certain threats to the stability of the region. We've seen from the research conducted by myself, conducted through Radio Free Europe by Noah Tucker and his colleagues, and by Emil Nasruddinov sitting in the back. Much of the focus group and interview research on countering violent extremism within Central Asia points to the role of corruption, the role of negative interactions with law enforcement, and the role of sort of specific repressive practices adopted by local authorities as key drivers, as key sort of key reasons that certain individuals have joined extremist groups. So I think what has caused a greater amount of violence, a greater amount of casualties, is of course the authoritarian governments of the region themselves, whose repressive practices have resulted in thousands of casualties over the past 27 years of independence, far more casualties than terrorism has caused. So I think we need to sort of flip the question in that way. We also need to, just to finally, to finish on, I think we also need to sort of shift our attention. Why are we focusing on the 0.05% of Central Asians who've joined terrorist groups and carried out attacks, causing, as we've said, sort of 142 casualties? Why are we focusing on that when there's a more interesting question around why the 99.995% of the rest of Central Asia have remained quiescent despite the difficulties they face? And I think really, and we're already seeing a move towards this in the sort of countering violent extremism community, really we need to focus not so much on the drivers of radicalization, but the drivers and causes of resilience in communities. Look to the ways in which certain communities have their own practices, their own mechanisms, often of which sort of exist organically, independently of the state, independently of external interventions, that have the opportunity and the ability to mitigate recruitment, radicalization, potentially conflict. And I think so we need to look sort of at the 99.95% rather than the 0.005% that we've been focusing on thus far. Anyway, thank you all for coming today and listening to me speak about this important topic.